Welcome, everyone. We'll just wait another few seconds just so that everyone can join before we start. So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for this webinar. This lunchtime requires improvement, why 11 to 16 education needs urgent change. So firstly, let me introduce myself. My name is Heather King, and I am a Professor of Science Education at King's College London, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this webinar today together with the Policy Institute at King's. Today we have an hour for a webinar, and you can see we have some esteemed speakers joining us today. And I'm really looking forward to hearing what they have to say. We have both authors and contributors to the Lord's Special Inquiry Committee report on education between the 11 to 16 age range. And they will be speaking about their inquiry report and also the government's recent response. Now, I'm sure many on the call have already read the report. If you haven't, I very much urge you to do so, as I'm sure you'll be nodding your head furiously at many of the important points raised. It covers the whole spectrum of issues facing the education system between 11 to 16, and I think some really important questions there, and you'll be intrigued to hear what the government says as well, I'm sure. But just as a brief summary, the House of Lords Special Inquiry Committee called for an urgent re-evaluation of the education system, and perhaps some of the headlines that they highlighted was that secondary schools focus far too extensively on academic rigidity and exam preparation. They also said that the English Baccalaureate, the EBacc system, has inadvertently marginalised creative and technical subjects. Climate change education, sustainability education has been siloed and is not being addressed adequately enough to meet our agenda, our requirements. And students, as a result, are emerging ill-equipped for post-16 options, without the skills to go forward into the contemporary workplace, without the skills to even partake in many of the global challenges facing us. So, lots to talk about this morning or this lunchtime. Just let me explain our order of speakers. Each speaker is going to speak for about 5 minutes or so. So then there's plenty of time for questions. Please do put your questions into the Q&A, and I will then try and organise those questions at the end. You can also upvote, which means essentially you sort of like one of the questions, and then that rises to the top of the list to make sure that that question gets asked. So this morning we're going to be hearing first from Jo Johnson, former Minister for Universities and Science and the chair of the Lords Committee on this 11 to 16 education. Next, we'll be hearing from Sarah Fletcher, who's the High Mistress from St Paul's Girls' School. Then we will hear from Lord Kenneth Baker, former Education Secretary and member of the inquiry. Then over to Carolyn Roberts, head of Thomas Tallis School in South East London. And finally, we will hear from Lord Jim Knight, again, a former schools minister and also a member of the inquiry. Okay, so I think without further ado, we'll go straight over to you, Jo.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Heather. Good to be here and good to be with my fellow panelists. The fact that the government's rejected all the major recommendations of what was a cross-party House of Lords Select Committee report, which called, as you said, Heather, for fundamental reform of education, was certainly disappointing, but it actually wasn't altogether surprising, I think we have to say. We have a very strong period of ministerial tenure by Nick Gibb, and the influence of him and of Michael Gove on the department is considerable. And I didn't expect them to have a sort of a Damascene conversion overnight just by virtue of reading our report. The case for change, however, really is overwhelming. And I do believe it will still confront whoever is in power after the next election. The evidence we heard during the course of what was almost a year-long inquiry from dozens and dozens of witnesses and hundreds of written submissions was overwhelming and really very, very clear. And you skated over in your introduction, Heather, some of our major recommendations. But I will quickly outline the sort of the broad thrust of the report so we can frame our discussion. One of the most important central recommendations was that we need to reform the accountability measures in our system. The national curriculum that's been imposed on schools since 2010 ends up being too limited or simply wrong for too many young people because of the way these accountability measures, the accountability structures, incentivize a very narrow focus on 8 academic GCSE subjects, particularly where we were referring to the EBacc, which has created a clear subject hierarchy with creative and technical subjects frequently squeezed out in favor of academic learning. So that's why in our report, we call for the clear abandonment of the EBacc in its entirety, including, therefore, the government's ambition that by 2025, 90% of pupils should be studying this particular subject combination. It was our view as a committee, and I think very much the view of everybody, or of a very clear majority of people who gave evidence to us, that schools need greater flexibility to offer the subjects that are best for their pupils, because that's key to enabling more pupils, more learners to progress to the full range of options available to them in post-16 education, including apprenticeships, which the government wants to support. Each year at the moment, about 1/3 of pupils do not even achieve a pass grade in academic GCSE English and maths, despite literacy and numeracy skills being absolutely essential for their future education opportunities, as well as obviously employment and life in general. And we heard from many people who gave evidence to us that these pupils who are left behind end up having far more limited options in the post-16 phase and can feel that they've been labeled as failures for life. So to help such students, one of our recommendations as a committee was that alongside these academic maths and English GCSEs, we should create alternative tests of equivalent esteem in the accountability structures in functional maths and functional English. Again, however, this recommendation was rejected. Loosening the constraints of the EBacc will be key to stopping the stifling of design, artistic, technical, digital, and practical learning in our schools. We really need clear routes into post-16 technical education, which the government wants to support, but which is clearly being limited by the way the 11 to 16 phase is currently operating. The post-2010 reforms have clearly led to the neglect of these artistic, technical, digital, and practical subjects, and worsened what was already a very poor record in the UK in terms of offering these vocational subjects. The EBacc forces what are very time-pressured schools to drop design and technology. And today, there are 70% fewer GCSE entrants, for example, in design than in 2010. And dance, drama, and music have all seen declines in GCSE entrants of up to 50%. So, overhaul of the EBacc with all of the benefits it would bring, appeared to us to be absolutely central for 11 to 16 reform. We also, though, found as a committee that the weight of assessment at the end of the 11 to 16 phase has become far too burdensome. Exam stress is a very real problem, and it's driving the epidemic of mental health issues across our system. And we really have a very disproportionate assessment model at the end of the 11 to 16 phase. Now, obviously, while there does need to be some kind of formal assessment at 16, given the number of pupils who change institutions at this age, it's presently disproportionate given that pupils must now remain in education or training up until 18 anyway. So exam season at 16, where many pupils are undergoing more than 30 hours of assessment, is simply out of kilter with what's needed. Yes, GCSE results may underpin school performance measures, and that's important that we have a means of assessing school performance, but we should not let the tail wag the dog and accept that as a justification for this disproportionately burdensome system of assessment. And that's why, as a committee, we supported a slimmed down form of assessment at 16. We also recommended slimming down the knowledge content required for GCSEs, which at present are rather overstuffed and force students to rote learn and force demoralized staff to rush through GCSE content, to teach to the test, and to prioritize exam preparation at the expense of deeper understanding of key concepts or the development of important skills such as communication, problem solving, and creativity. And we heard that some schools are starting GCSE courses a year early, simply to get through the extensive content crammed into the GCSEs, limiting pupils' ability to study the full range of Key Stage 3 subjects up to the end of Year 9. So that's why one of our final recommendations was that we must have a review of the Key Stage 3 curriculum and significantly reduce the content load of GCSEs, freeing up time in the school timetable for schools to offer wider subjects, including the creative subjects that I mentioned earlier. So in conclusion, Heather, our report was not the first to make these points, and I think this is really important. We were just building on the work of a number of other very important reviews undertaken by HMC, by the High Mistress of St. Paul's, and by the Times Education Commission, by the Institute for Government, and others. We were just the latest to come to these conclusions, albeit on the back of independent evidence that we heard. We were dismissed in terms of the government's response, and that's of course the government's right, just as other committees' work has been dismissed. But my personal view is that this represents a very considerable missed opportunity for millions of young people, and I do think that as a country we can do a lot better. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you also for a lovely summary of some of the key points. Very much agree with the emphasis on knowledge content and the stress that causes both teachers and students. And indeed, that's something that my colleagues in the School of Education have researched extensively. So we completely share that point. Let's now hear from Sarah Fletcher, so High Mistress of St. Paul's Girls' School, who, as Joe has said, has also been working in this area, reflecting deeply on what education should look like. Yeah, over to you, Sarah. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you for asking me to be part of this panel. So for my part too, I find the government's response very disappointing. Of all of the recommendations that the Lord's report has, it accepts only 4. First, that we have a problem with the take-up of languages, which is plain to see, but it thinks it has this in hand. I'm not really sure that many in the profession would agree with that. Second, that we need to improve our careers provision, which I think no one would argue with. Third, that it agrees that performance measures and accountability structures need to be balanced, but it argues that they already are. And as we have heard, this is despite the fact that schools in this country are subject to much more scrutiny than anywhere else in the world, and that much of that scrutiny involves student results, which inevitably skews the way the curriculum is delivered. It also agrees that breadth is important, but it's happy that it already exists sufficiently at Key Stage 3 and 4, as we've heard. There are real questions about that, and it doesn't feel that any adjustments are necessary. So there is no undertaking, as we've heard, to review 11 to 16 education, even in any limited form, and that, as Lord Johnson has said, despite numerous reports which suggest that there is genuine concern within the profession and tertiary education and amongst employers, which suggests that really now is the time that we need to do this. So what I want to do is just focus very briefly on 4 points at this stage. First, I would like to challenge the government's insistence on a knowledge-based curriculum, which is a constant reference point against which no criticism is allowed. See, in education, you know that one size doesn't fit all. And yet we have a strategy, and we've had a strategy in place for the last 10 years, which is focused on apparently immovable mantras, and this is one of them. So at Key Stage 4, as we've heard, we've seen content increased in all subjects to the detriment of space to explore and to think. We've seen assessment focus on subject recall, much more so than on analysis and independent thinking. And although the government will argue that these skills are present in the GCSEs, in reality, they're only present in very modest proportion. So I would ask the government to reread the Durham report on creativity and to listen to calls for wider skills from amongst teachers, employers and tertiary education. Of course, knowledge is important, but knowledge and creativity shouldn't fight one another, but should work in tandem to engage and inspire. And by creativity, to be clear, I mean a combination of those wider skills and dispositions like curiosity and critical thinking, reflection, collaboration and problem solving, all of the processes involved in coming up with your own ideas, which are robust, well-informed and well-researched. And that's a complex business, rich in skills and rich in the dispositions that the modern world needs. So creativity at its best is actually more rigorous than subject recall. And we need this if we as a country and if young people as individuals are to navigate the way ahead wisely, and if we are to frame an education which is more engaging and relevant. And in that context, I would also argue, as has been argued already, that there needs to be a re-evaluation of the importance of the more traditionally designated creative subjects like music, art, dance, drama, and I would include technology design. Those subjects naturally support the development of creative skills, and they need much more recognition and support. But underfunding, as well as curriculum space, is woeful, and numbers taking their subject are dropping. Money for materials in schools is lacking, and I know primary schools locally who weigh the merits of counselling versus the provision of music to the detriment of the latter, for example. The teenage brain is at its most creative between 14 and 16, and we need to capitalise on that, not force people into rote learning. Now, my second point is about assessment. Exams are claimed to be an unalloyed great leveller, but they're not. Many do not thrive when asked to memorise information for use in an exam room, and the pressure and weight of assessment is far more costly in wellbeing than the government recognises in its response. While I accept that some high-stakes assessment is important, other methods of monitoring and assessing progress need more careful research and pilot schemes. At the very least, I would argue that the HPQ should become an entitlement at Key Stage 4, which would immediately elevate the place with the value rather that we place on independent thinking and creativity. And my third point is to emphasise the importance of looking again at digital skills and the competencies that young people need. And that includes facility with an understanding of new and emerging technologies. I would invite the government to read Mustafa Saleh's book, The Coming Wave. We depend on future generations' understanding of the power and pitfalls of AI if we're to harness positively this extraordinary digital revolution. And in this context, the government also needs to recognise the importance of ongoing guidance to schools on approaches to AI, so it enhances teaching and learning, and we avoid the myriad possible unintended consequences which little currently is being done to forestall. And last for now, I would urge the government to look again at the high-performing education systems it quotes across the world, Singapore, Finland, Estonia, Canada, South Korea, and not to cherry pick. It's all very well adopting techniques in maths that East Asian countries employ, but what about the other things that they're all doing to raise educational standards? Most of these countries are looking at educational reform with a view to unlocking creativity. None impose such high stakes assessment at 16 as we do. All prioritise the recruitment, training and reward of high quality teaching staff. And importantly, all align policies and practices across the entire education system to ensure progression and coherence, which is really not the case here. So what I would ask again, as the Lord's report does, for a proper cross-party review in collaboration with schools, tertiary education and business, and for the development of a non-political 10-year plan for education. I really hope that the next Parliament will support this view. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Brilliant points raised there. Again, useful references as well that audience members might like to follow up on, both reading the House of Lords inquiry, but also to return to the Durham report you mentioned there, for example. Again, talking about the importance of creativity. So maybe we will see if we can put that into the chat if we can, so that others can also reference that. Right, now I invite Lord Kenneth Baker, former Education Secretary, and again, member of the committee, for your comments on the report and the
Yes. Well, first, Heather, thank you very much for holding this discussion. This is the first public discussion of this report. It was not given much coverage when it came out in November. Even the broadsheets didn't cover it. And this is a very important report. And I was very glad to be following Sarah Fletcher, because she started these. There have been 7 reports, and hers was the first, HMC, 2 years ago, which said that the curriculum and exams were not fit for purpose. It was followed by a select committee from the House of Lords on unemployment, skills for all, which recommended the changes that we recommended. It was followed by the Times, as James has said, the Times Commission, and also with Tony Blair's body and the Institute of Government. This is the 7th report saying there's got to be a fundamental change in the curriculum and the exam system. And I'm very depressed that the government has rejected it all. The trouble is, since 2010, it's the Department of Education that has run education. I've known the last 10 Secretaries of State, and they were a poor bunch, apart from Justine Greening. And they've been cradled in the arms of the civil servants, and this is the Department of Education speaking and defending the present system, root and branch. And I'm depressed by that. I am very glad to be following Sarah, because she has pioneered the changes. The particular changes that I would like to focus upon is that now the leaving age is 18, there is no real need for a demanding exam at 16. We're the only country in Europe that has a really demanding, life-changing exam at 16. And we recommended there should be a much shorter number of GCSEs. The Latimer School in London, we drew attention to, within 3 years is going down to just 2 GCSEs tested in, sitting in a hall, maths and English. The rest will still, the subjects will be taught, but they'll be assessed internally. By doing that, they gain 40% of teaching time, because now in the spring term and summer term, virtually nothing new is taught in schools. Nothing new is taught. It's revision and it's exams, then going home. And if it's narrowed, they're therefore increasing their curriculum and including things like psychology, anthropology, history of pop music, drama, the culture of the Asian countries, and things of this sort. And there's an increase in 40% teaching time if you narrow down GCSEs. And as James did say, we also recommend that the actual knowledge content of GCSE should be reduced. And I was very glad to see Sarah's very strong condemnation of knowledge-rich curriculum. The only defender of the knowledge-rich curriculum we had was Gibb. Gibbs means goes man on earth, defending this system. And you mustn't forget that when an Ofsted inspector goes into a school, the first question they ask of the head is, what are you doing in EBacc and Progress 8? And if you're not doing well there, you have no chance of an outstanding or possibly even of a good. It has dominated the whole education system, and it's time it should be scrapped. And that is what our recommendation has been. We also focus very much upon the fact that the school leaving age is now really 18. And at that age, youngsters want employability skills as well. And industry is very clear about this. Industry told us again and again they want employability skills, by which they mean they want youngsters who've experienced teamwork. Because life after you left school is teamwork. Your university is collaborative problem solving through teamwork. A whole life is that. And they have no experience of that at all. The only teams in schools are sporting teams. Whereas when you have projects to work on, like in the UTCs, teams of 5 are set up, and the youngsters working together as a team learn a great deal. They learn confidence, they learn a capacity to express themselves, they learn a better way of speaking, actually, about what they're doing. They also want imagination and creativity. Imagination and creativity aren't tested at all by GCSEs, nor is curiosity. It is just, churning it all out from what you learned and then forget it as soon as you can. And so this is a very radical report. Now, the encouraging thing is that early this morning on the Today programme, I think it was between 6 and 7, I heard Bridget Phillipson. And she said, she was the shadow education sector. She said very clearly, we're going to get the broad and balanced curriculum back. She said specifically, it needs vocational subjects. It needs a return to the cultural subjects, dance, drama, music, and art, which have been dropped by 50%. Design technology has been dropped by 80%. Now, that's immensely encouraging. And I hope, Jim, that will feature very strongly in your manifesto, because it won't feature in the Conservative manifesto at all. This is going to be a disaster for us, in my view, in education. There's very little new we can say. And I think that it is time for a change. And I'm encouraged by that, because basically you've got to get ministers interested in the actual curriculum. And quite frankly, the last 10 we've had, apart from Michael Gove, have not really been interested in the curriculum at all. And Gove imposed upon our system a system devised by an American education equality Hirsch, who said that if you just subject children, most disadvantaged children, to technical education, they'll be improved. No American state has tried it. We've been the test bed of it now for 13 years, and we still have the same number of disadvantaged students who can't get to levels 4 in English and maths as we had in 2000, 300,000. So it hasn't worked. Time for a change. And I hope that that is going to be recognised. The only other thing I would say is that we've now put a proposal to the department to have an UTC sleeve, University Technology College sleeve of technical education in ordinary schools. They seem to like the idea, because this is going to be the quickest way to get a vocational into ordinary schools. If you can have a sleeve with different teachers, different classrooms, some workshops with technical equipment, following a UTC curriculum, which means that from 14 to 16, youngsters spend at least 2 days a week in a workshop, in a computer design room, or in a business. That is the characteristic of UTC sleeve. Now, we've got 10 schools that want to do it, 10 secondary schools across the country. And the government has said, well, we rather like it, but we're actually expecting them to say publicly that they like it. And we encourage them to do that, because they've got to have the commitment behind it. We've got to make a change like that. We've got to have the government to get behind it. And I'm hopeful that the government will get behind it, because that's going to be the cheapest way. It'll only cost about between 1.5 and 2 million to change a school. To build a new technical school would cost about 15 million. And we're not going to have, in the next 10 years, hardly any new schools built, because of the decline in student population and the fact that our present quality of the state is an appalling condition. And so UTC sleeves is going to be a very important part of introducing high quality technical education into schools. That's all I have to say.
Lovely. Thank you, Lord Baker. Again, many good points raised there. I'm really pleased that the Policy Institute is recording this because it will be available to watch on the YouTube channel so that we can pick up on these points and issues later. Right, next we go to another head teacher. So we're hearing from Carolyn Roberts, head of the Thomas Tallis School. You've got lots to respond to there with the previous speakers, Carolyn, but I'm sure you've also got your own points to make. So over to you.
Indeed, I do. Thank you, Heather. Thank you. Thank you, team. It's interesting that we are depressed by the government's response to the report. The government's response to the report was highly predictable, as many have said. But one of the reasons for it is because nobody has a very clear idea of what schools are for. And so for the 93% of young people who are educated in the state sector, there is no real view about what society wants from that. Are they where society looks after its young until they're old enough to take on the mantle of adult responsibility? Or are schools essentially just public sector delivery mechanisms, outfits? I've been a head teacher for 23 years in 3 different schools, and my commitment has always been to a broad and balanced curriculum with a strong academic base, really well qualified teachers, but a really strong engagement with the learning, so that when young people leave us, when they transfer somewhere else at 16 or stay with us or whatever, that they will want to carry on learning throughout their lives. There's nothing wrong with a national curriculum. There's nothing wrong with exams at 16, except we do far too many of them for far too long. The problem is that we don't know what we're doing them for, and therefore they get used in a very particular way. So I'm just going to talk very briefly about the problems that we've got with the mindset of what schools are. So the mindset of accountability has turned into the single drive of the curriculum in almost all schools. So if the EBacc aim is for the 95%, if Progress 8 is the be all and end all of how a school is measured, well, then that's turned into what head teachers value. And younger head teachers went to school when this was happening to them. They've become head teachers entirely in this accountability context, and find it really difficult to lift their heads beyond the accountability measures to look at what schools are for. And this is one of the reasons that teacher recruitment and retention is in such crisis, because the turning over of schools to this very narrow curriculum and narrow range of outcomes makes teaching a less joyful and interesting activity, as well as issues with pay and the very significant challenges post-COVID about behaviour. Ofsted really need to carry on looking at curriculum. They've been looking at curriculum for 5 years now, but they need to be able to write much more detailed and nuanced reports about what they find about the curriculum and what it is that schools are doing well. The single judgment is not helping any of this. So what schools need to do, as the report says, is to focus on what the children need. And what they need is a broad and balanced curriculum with plenty of time for self-exploration. And that sounds really soft, but it isn't. We're talking about creativity, not just in the arts and the practical subjects, but in the way that children are enabled to think. And they'll only cope with the artificial intelligence world that they're inheriting if they can think for themselves. The other thing that we need is enough flexibility in the curriculum to make sure that the most reluctant learners, the children who take longer to acquire knowledge, have got a foothold in school. So they want to stay at school. They want to carry on learning. And the way that we get this through to them is through teachers, expert, passionate, happy teachers, and loosening the stranglehold of the EBacc and doing something different for accountability will enable this. We could see an upsurge in bright young graduates wanting to be teachers in secondary schools if the secondary school experience was freer and more intellectually rewarding for them. The curriculum that we've got is cheap in so many dimensions. It's based on a very predictable financial model without any extras, and it takes a lot of experience and a lot of nerve to take risks with that. We still offer 27 GCSEs. We still offer 26 A levels. We're a big school, so we can do that. But we also do it because we can see that there is a purpose to what we're doing. We're trying to educate children to understand the world and change it for the better. We're not just after accountability. When the national curriculum was first put in place, there was a marvellous line in it which said that what the curriculum does should also help to enable and encourage a just and sustainable democracy. I believe that the government are concerned about the state of our democracy because the Prime Minister said so a couple of weeks ago. And we can actually do something about this. We can do something about engaged and intelligent citizens by enabling secondary schools to really do what they're meant to be doing, which is to generate those young people who can participate in that. I spend a lot of time talking to school leaders about ethical approaches to the curriculum, ethical approaches to school management. And I always say the same thing at the end, and I'll say it now. Accountability is not enough. We have to do good.
Thank you, Carolyn. Great point to end on. Absolutely agree. I also liked your points there about the importance of thinking about teachers as well, as they too are central to our education system, and worrying about teacher attention and the stresses that teachers experience due to, for example, the high stakes accountability systems. Absolutely, we need to be considering that too. Okay, so finally we have Jim Knight. Jim, also a former schools minister and a member of the House of Lords Special Inquiry Committee. Jim, there's also a comment that's come through, a question, just a heads up on this, and also following up from Kenneth's comment about Bridget Phillipson's interview on the Today programme, asking what Labour might be doing if they form the next government. So I don't know if you want to add that into your comments here as well, but over to you. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Heather. And despite what Kenneth might wish, the manifesto is not entirely in my hands. And certainly not even education policy is entirely in my hands. So I'll try and give as much of an indication as I can. And I saw another question there around the extent to which the civil service would sort of dampen any radical zeal that the new ministers may have. Look, our civil servants are, by and large, a highly professional lot, and they will look carefully at what the wording of the manifesto is and try and help ministers to deliver on that. I fear that with in particular Nick, who is well motivated around wanting to do the best for children. I just think he's wrong. But Nick Gibb, having been in place for so long, there's a bit of a culture capture that has taken place within the department, and that might need a little bit of work to move them on from the knowledge-rich curriculum. But what I wanted to say, Heather, was, I can't add to the eloquent explanation that Joe has given of the report and the comments that Sarah, Ken, and Carolyn have given. But to say that, we've got some serious problems in our school system. Teachers are leaving the profession in droves much faster than we can recruit them in. Pupils' attendance is in serious decline, and there's a major worry. Our school buildings themselves are crumbling. Our attainment is stalling, and at its very best, the school system fails a third of pupils. And then we as taxpayers carry that as a dead weight cost as those people move into being adults and cost more in our health service, more in our welfare system, and are part of the reason why the state itself is becoming unsustainable, with us paying ever higher rates of tax for diminishing quality of public services. And so alongside really significant external change, we have to change the system in order to right that and make it fully inclusive and work for every pupil. And those external changes are worth reflecting on. We have to move to a sustainable economy where we're no longer exploiting the planet and each other. We have to do so in the context of new forms of technology, artificial intelligence, biomedicine that are going to radically change the world that my 12-year-old who's at school at the moment, the world that she leaves school to go into in 10 years' time is just going to be very different to the one we live now, let alone the one that this current curriculum and this current school system was designed for many, many years ago. So Carolyn's right to challenge us to think afresh about what schools are for in the context of all of that change that's going on externally to schools. Now, as a committee, we had to, in the end, focus on our brief on 11 to 16 and on curriculum, accountability and assessment. We strayed a little into post-16, and there are profound problems in the 16 to 19 area where, in particular, whilst the A-level to university route might be working okay for those that can access it, that's what, 38% of pupils. So that leaves the remaining 63% of pupils, I think, poorly served, with T-levels not working brilliantly. They're overly burdensome, I think, and they need streamlining. And access to apprenticeships were not working for very many because, as the committee report pointed out, the problems around the GCSE English and Maths requirement to be able to access and complete a level 3 apprenticeship. And those need significant change. And I would love to see some significant change around higher education admissions and moving more towards portfolios of attainment at the end of school, rather than just a crude measure around A-levels. But beyond that, we weren't able to get into inspection, and I see one or two questions around Ofsted, or the regulation of schools, because the Education Select Committee and House of Commons were looking at those things. But there is but Carolyn's talked to those, and there is a significant cost to the mistrust that is endemic in our system. The ministers at the department do not trust teachers. They do not trust the profession. They impose a huge burden of cost on the system. And if we could liberate that and trust professionals once more, we might be able to persuade some of those professionals to remain in the profession a bit longer, because at the core of any successful school system is the quality of the teachers who are working in it. And that has to be a focus of an incoming government, is what are we going to do about recruitment and retention? Because whatever our model for the curriculum is, we need the best people in the classroom empowered and harnessing technology to help them to be able to deliver. And I would incidentally love to see Ken's UTC sleeve as part of that offer, properly resourced and with an alternative accountability system to the EBacc to make that fly. And then finally, Heather, I would just add that, I chair the Council of British International Schools, so I'm lucky to go around the world and look at some of our best independent international schools and what they're doing. I was in New York 3 weeks ago at the Avenue School, which is, ridiculously better resourced than any state-maintained school in England. But it's just inspirational to see what they're doing in terms of teaching critical thinking, metacognition, teaching some of the skills that enable their learners to be able to thrive in whatever change is coming in society in the future. And I really worry about the competitive advantage that our private schools are gaining, because they've got more time and they've got more resource to hang on to those teachers. And we have to be more ambitious for our state system. It has to be more than just knowledge-rich academic achievement. It has to also be creativity, critical thinking, physical literacy. It has to be the whole lot, developing our learners to succeed, because we, as a nation, cannot afford the volume of failures that are being churned out by our schools at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, here, thank you. So thank you to our panel of speakers. Now we have about 15 minutes for questions from the floor. I'm just going to try and amalgamate a couple there actually, and to follow on from what Jim was saying about the need for critical thinking, for creativity, and potentially thinking outside the box of the standard way of doing things, this knowledge-rich curriculum, this emphasis on exams. And a couple of our attendees are asking about the opportunities afforded outside of school, so to speak. So firstly, about the informal education sector, how museums, galleries and other providers might be working more closely with schools, or how we might do that to support critical thinking and creativity. And relatedly, if not the informal education sector, how about the business community? How might we be doing more to work with the business community and employers in the future to potentially provide those additional inputs that we have recognised within this report and in our discussions today are so essential for young people's kind of future development. So the informal sector and working with businesses. Who would like to have a go at responding or commenting more on that?
I'd be happy to talk about business, if I may, because the UGC, the colleges that I've set up, there are 44 of them with 20,000 students, and the main feature is the involvement of local businesses. They're on the board, they're often the majority of the board. They determine the local curriculum, which will be different from Newcastle to Plymouth, for example. And then they are expected, if necessary, to help with the teaching of the students and also to bring in projects for the students to work on. Rolls-Royce brings in piston plants, make a piston pump and explains it, and then you set up teams to do it. You've got to involve business into it. You've got to make, and as a result, you bring back learning by hands in school. When I was at grammar school in 1945, I did 2 hours of carpentry. I've learned how to do dovetail and tenon joints. All that's gone. There's no learning in hands in schools today, in most state schools. And as a result, we have very, very low levels of unemployability. In UTCs, we have 3% joining NEETs. The general normal number for schools is 11.2%. So the point I want to make is bring in industry and bring back learning by hands into schools.
Lovely, thank you. And also the point there about the making it local to the actual area where the children are living, and so that it's relevant to them in terms of the potential employees and so forth. I agree. Sarah, you have your hands up as well, so do you want to jump in?
I think that all the points that Kenneth makes are absolutely brilliant and echo what we're doing with computing and creative technologies as well. We have lots of people coming into school, offering electives. Teachers can't possibly keep pace with digital change, for example.
You learn by it.
And bringing them into school, we can really excite young people about the future. And, you know, young people are brilliant. I think we underestimate how much they can do if we give them a chance. But I did want to say something as well about museums and art galleries, because they really want to engage as well. And it's extraordinary how much they are prepared to come into schools and do work with us. Again, it comes back to this issue of time. If we haven't got time within the curriculum, we haven't got space for all of this, how can we do it? But I really think that there needs to be a proper conversation about education, which involves all of us. Because all of us can put our heads together and come up with something which is a lot more creative, interesting and engaging. There are numbers of museums, zoos, engaging on sustainability projects, for example, with young people, putting together all sorts of really rather wonderful resources. But they're peripheral at the moment, and what we have to do is to create those spaces within the curriculum where young people can really engage. And as the point's been made, young people need to get to grips with some of the issues facing the world, with the culture around them, with the various heritages around them, in order that they can really feel connected, and in order that they can feel that their education is authentic and empowering. And that's what we can do if we work both with these sort of, if you like, the sort of third sector education and also with businesses. So I'm really very much for it.
Lovely, thanks, Sarah. And Carolyn, did you want to come in on this point as well?
Yes, it's really important that we work with outside bodies. They bring a huge amount into school, but but the economics of schools is that we spend 80 to 85% of our budget on staffing. The staffing that we've got often isn't quite what it ought to be. We are expected to account for every hour of that teacher time. Any kind of liaison with outside bodies involves time. It's great for teachers. Teachers really love doing this stuff. I did it when I was a young teacher, but schools simply can't afford to put that time on one side. We don't have enough teachers, and we can't afford to give them that amount of spare time.
Thank you. Time is always a pressing issue for teachers, absolutely, and trying to juggle what we can prioritise. I agree, you know, how we can do all this, but paying more attention to these other ways that people can support provision absolutely is key. Okay. Jim,
Heather,
yeah.
can I just add? I quickly posted in the chat a wonderful resource that the museum and galleries sector led by the V&A has put in for creative careers advice called Wonder What, which is just beautiful. And to add, you know, theatres. Yeah, my wife's my daughter's an opera director. Theatres are desperate to get more schools, and I was talking last week to what used to be the Society of West End Theatres. I can't remember what they're called now, but they're trying to get an entitlement for every child to have a visit to the theatre during their school life. Because museums and galleries are free, they are more attractive to the cost of going to the theatre. But it's really important, you know, going back to the work of Sir Ken Robinson, but you know, thinking about that in the modern context, it's really important that we can find the resource and the time, as has been said, to deliver that alongside that business engagement that Ken talked about.
Yeah, I agree with that. Could I just add one point? When one talks of vocational, it's not just about engineering and computing. In UTCs, we now have one in Liverpool that does bioscience, and it's like laboratories. We have one at the east end of London, mainly full of Bangladeshi girls, 2/3 of which are doing medicine, health, and social care, and the other third are doing creative writing with the National Theatre. And because you must appreciate that about 1/3 of the jobs in London are all contained with the wider entertainment industry, and the entertainment industry and the restaurants and all that go with it. And schools have got to realise they should produce technical people who can cope technically with that. We have one UTC at Heathrow that just focuses upon radio technology, and half the classrooms are like recording studios, and they go straight into jobs.
Thank you. I'm going to turn now to another question that was coming up through the panelists' presentations and is also being echoed in the Q&A. And this is going back to the fact that there is this weight of assessment has become burdensome to the system, and particularly to teachers. How the EBacc the whole kind of accountability process can be very demanding and narrowing for schools and stressful for teachers. And again, what Carolyn was saying about the importance of loosening the stranglehold of accountability to ensure teacher retention. So I'd like to know what we can do to support teachers a little more with the reviews that you yourselves developed in the inquiry. How we can perhaps support teachers, give them more autonomy, maybe help them to work through the accountability procedures, or change the accountability procedures. You've done a few things. You've said a few things about the EBacc, for example, and the knowledge-rich content. So yes, what can we do to support teachers more, reprofessionalize teachers? Jim? Do you want to go first on this one?
Yes, thanks. Look, as I said earlier, it's the most fundamental and pressing question for any incoming government to address. I think Michael Gove's first white paper when he entered sanctuary buildings was entitled something like "The Importance of Teachers." So, yeah, we might be able to revive the title, if not the content. And you know, at its heart is, what's the intrinsic motivation of teachers? I don't think we solve this by throwing more money at teachers. You know, yes, teachers need to be properly rewarded and properly paid. We do need to reflect that they will have, you know, been at university with their peers who might have gone into work at quite possibly a similar starting salary, but are able to accelerate in pay quite quickly, but also have more flexibility of working. And you know, is there more that we can do around flexible working for teachers, more part-time teaching, etc.? But most importantly, it's the intrinsic motivation, and it is reconnecting teachers with what they're able to do to help children, what they're able to do to really communicate the big ideas of their subject, if they're subject teachers, not be dragged down by all the detail and minutiae that we burden them with in terms of the content, particularly at Key Stage 4. So yeah, that's where I would go. I would be far less prescriptive. You know, even our initial teacher training and the early careers teaching framework is highly prescriptive with presumptions around what the appropriate pedagogy is for this knowledge-rich curriculum. And essentially, it's about reprofessionalizing teaching rather than it being trapped in this framework that's been passed down by ministers and by the department. Trust them, reprofessionalize them, lean into their intrinsic motivation.
And therefore,
sorry.
Carolyn.
And therefore, what teachers need, they need to be able to do the things that took them into teaching in the first place. So that's teach their subjects. So it's to do with giving them good quality CPD on their subjects and keeping them up to date with that. And also to enable them to understand what it is that they want to do for society by being teachers. That's really important for them as well. So they need time, and they need to be treated like adults, like professional, intellectual adults in the workplace.
Can I come in, Heather? Is that okay?
Yes, Sarah, yes, please.
What I'd also like to say is that we need to give them training, and we need to give them opportunities to talk to each other and to share, and that means giving them time to do that. So one of the problems, I think, is that teacher training has focused an awful lot on the delivery of the curriculum that we've got. And some of the very creative methods of teaching require a very different sort of approach. And it's a much more risky approach, if you like, than standing in front of a class and delivering something which is set. Is one where, in fact, you're engaging young people in all sorts of discussion where perhaps you don't necessarily know all of the answers. And in order to do that, we need to give people the space to talk to each other, to train, to share ideas. And by that, I don't mean really expensive kind of national training, but I mean schools in hubs, schools working together locally, sharing opportunities. And I think we can easily do that within the professional. That would be hugely empowering and enriching. And again, as Carolyn has said, providing teachers with the time and the trust to be able to do this and to do what, in fact, teaching should be really about, which is preparing young people for a really extraordinarily challenging but very exciting world that they're about to enter, not just about passing exams.
Thanks, Sarah. I think that comment there, not just about passing exams, is coming through loud and clear. The need to address our current assessment systems, the accountability process throughout as well. So unfortunately, although there are plenty of questions still going in the chat, and I'm sure that all our panelists today have much more they'd like to say, we have come to the end of our allotted hour. As I said at the beginning, this has been recorded, so it will be available on YouTube. But I'd like to thank everyone for taking part today and for also raising the questions and the issues in the original inquiry. We are looking forward to what happens next. Although the government response hasn't been positive to the inquiry's recommendations. Perhaps things will change as we go forward, because these are important questions and they do need to be addressed. So thank you again for raising them with me today, and thank you all for taking part. And I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all the questions, but I'm glad that the conversation is so vibrant and that people clearly care about our education system. So thank you very much all.
Okay.